Okay, I think we could begin now. Can we begin? Okay. Everything all set? Okay. So welcome to the first in a series of programs focused on redefining the academic library. There's been a lot of attention to this, as I think probably all of us in academics know. There's no place in the university that's changing more rapidly than academic libraries. And the changes began a number of years ago, and maybe kind of previewing the kinds of changes we're seeing in the whole academic marketplace, as we call it today, as there are so many players offering higher education these days. But some of the first changes really began in academic libraries. And so our library and other libraries have already been undergoing change at the speed of light, or digitally, change at the speed of digital stuff. It really is, it's been interesting to watch. We talk a lot about budgets and that driving decisions, and that's really been a big part of the challenges that we faced with libraries. We have this kind of weird situation where we produce the intellectual property and do the intellectual work, and then we give it to somebody else who sells it back to us at really higher and higher and higher prices. So that kind of economy, I'm hoping that we're going to kind of fix going forward. And I know that librarians have really been at the front of taking on that kind of public policy and economic change, and that's a good thing. But there are also things that maybe are driven in part by finances, but also really in terms of increasing access. So, you know, I wonder if I couldn't have cut a year off of my graduate work because of the easy access to materials that we have now digitally. But actually, there's so many more of them, it probably would have taken me the same amount of time. But I remember myself kind of Xeroxing things in the basement of a university library and then going and reading them and that kind of thing. So there's just so much out there that's changing. There's so many options. And so I know that the role of libraries and librarians is really changing. And watching what that is has been very interesting. And so I give a lot of credit to the people that are librarians these days. And it was interestingly, when I was in junior high, kind of we do those vocational interest tests. They mapped me out as a librarian. And it was kind of funny at the time because I was really more of a kind of a party animal type of person. You know, the person that was going to be kicked out of the library for talking and joking around and that kind of thing. So I never really saw that fit. But the idea of being challenged by the kinds of changes that we're facing does really interest me. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay for this lecture, so I'm really glad that I'll watch the rest of the tapes, not myself, but the rest of it afterwards. And I hope you encourage other people that are not here today. So welcome. Thank you for joining in the collaboration that we have to look at the libraries of the future. I want to congratulate the Academic Library Committee, though I always give it as one of our highest functioning Senate committees. And so thank you. Oftentimes when we need for a committee to weigh in on issues, it's that committee that really does an excellent job and gives us the information we need, the plans we need, and so forth. So thank you to those of you. And then I think I also want to thank the people that are the users, the clients of the library, because we're also experiencing a lot of changes. And we also put a lot of pressure on the support that we need from the library to help us make some of those changes and to figure out how we're going to do what we know we need to do in this new environment and this new format. So having these conversations, I think, is the right thing to do. There's a lot of the people here that can make a difference in terms of where we take things in the library in the future. So today we have a speaker who's coming from Grand Valley State University and talk about changes in a university. This institution has really, really grown over the years. And when I was in Michigan, I really tracked it because in part they had a College of Interdisciplinary Studies, which I just thought was the coolest thing. And so now I'm here. We have 2 colleges of interdisciplinary studies, and we have interdisciplinary studies in a lot of other places. But at that time, I'd never heard of a College of Interdisciplinary Studies. I was really envious. And they also have a very, very strong honors program and honors college. So at Central Michigan, we really never could understand why students would go to Grand Valley instead of Central. But a lot of times, the students we were paying attention to were the ones that were really talking about the honors college. And I know you've had some involvement with that, and I think for us looking toward the future, we're going to be having another guest later this term to talk to us about our honors college and what the next steps might be there. So I really am here mostly to introduce our speaker. So thank you, Doug Way, for coming to join us and kicking off our series. He is head of collections and scholarly communications. And I wonder if that scholarly communications isn't a new part of that title. Yeah, because it used to be just the collections, we bring things in and we organize them, and now it's how are we getting them out to the public. So he's at Grand Valley State University. He's also held positions as head of liberal arts programs and as government documents librarian. Doug has written and spoken extensively on the use of academic library collections, collection management, and scholarly communications. He holds a master's degree from Wayne State University in Library and Information Science and resides in Western Michigan with his wife and 3 children. So welcome, Doug, welcome to you, and thanks again for visiting us and sharing your insights. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate it. I've only got 121 slides to go through, so we should be done about 4 or 5 hours. We'll have time for questions after that. So no, I'll speak for about a half hour, so we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So I think it goes. It's probably the least controversial thing I'll probably say today, that we're in an era of unprecedented change for academic libraries there. And many of the things that are changing are really things that are out of our control, things that we can't do anything about. Things like hyperinflation. So we have a chart here that shows monograph and serial expenditures from '86 through 2004. And you can see serial costs up 188%, while the CPI is only up 73%. And some of the results we're seeing from some of these changes are things like down at the very bottom, if you could read that. Monograph expenditures down 9%, and I think in many libraries that's very generous. I know libraries in Michigan that they're spending nothing. Last year they didn't acquire any monographs at all because there's just so much money being eaten up by the serials, and so these continuing resources and inflationary costs that we're seeing from those. You know, another thing like this, Harvard's Faculty Advisory Council just issued this memorandum 2 weeks ago saying that even Harvard can't afford to pay for the serials, and the costs are just out of control. And I think we can all say if Harvard can't afford it, then we probably really can't as comprehensive universities either there. So it's not, I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign, but it's definitely a sign. Other things out of control, the explosion in scholarly output. So we have a chart here that shows R&D spending up 60%. Journal production up 30%, while library budgets are only up 10%. We're also seeing declining support for higher education. Again, nothing new to anyone in this room probably, but we're seeing news source after news source after news source talking about how there's less and less money for higher education, how the budget pressures continue on. Again, I guess I can't speak for Washington. I know Michigan across the board, state institutions saw a 15% cut last year, and we're not looking for much of an increase this year. And what this means for libraries is a smaller piece of the pie for academic libraries. You can see in this chart here, this is library expenditures as a percentage of the overall university expenditures, and from 1982 to 2009, and the chart's pretty clear there. It's a downward cycle. I just read earlier this week, if this had been flatlined, libraries across the United States would have $3 billion additional spent on library resources there. So it's a large amount of money that we've had not coming to us there. And again, it's nobody's fault really except for just the decline support. There's less money to go around for everybody there. So, but at the same time, all these things are happening that really we can't control in libraries. Opportunities knocking for libraries there. And often this is really in the form of technology. The internet, mass digitization, just the overall proliferation of electronic resources is really creating a lot of windows of opportunities for libraries to change how they do things. Sometimes we have to do out of necessity, but sometimes, again, there's things we can do that we do them better than we could before. And which leads to sort of the first shift that we're seeing in academic libraries, which is really from building collections, as we've done in the past, to curating access to information. In the past, what happened was libraries built standalone collections, and this is really out of necessity. We had to do this. It was difficult to know what others owned. If you're familiar with, this is the National Union catalog, hundreds and hundreds of green volumes. I see lots of libraries now building Christmas trees out of these during the holiday season, posting pictures. I looked for, what I do with pictures, I just go on and do a Creative Commons search for pictures. And I kept on getting these Christmas trees when I searched for the Nook. And I was like, I don't understand. Then we had a new colleague came to us and she was like, oh, did you see our Christmas trees? And I'm like, what? And that's when I realized what libraries were doing with these things. So I don't know if you still have your National Union catalog. We still have ours. Apparently some things are hard to part with there. But it was difficult to know what other people owned. And if you did know what other people owned, it was really difficult. It was time consuming and expensive to get things from other libraries. It was not easy to get something from another library if you didn't have it there. And so what libraries did is we purchased just in case there. What we would do is of that. So the larger the library collection, it meant the better job you did of collecting in breadth. The more likely you were to have the things that our users would need. We still see that number used today, but the number doesn't really mean much anymore today because of electronic resources and some of the things we'll talk about here. But that was what we tried to do. The problem with this sort of model, this sort of anticipatory model, was that we're not good at guessing. Libraries, essentially that's what we're doing, is we're guessing someone's going to need this book, I'm going to buy this book there. But what we see, one of the first studies was the Kent study, which looked at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1970s, and they found that 40% of the books in the University of Pittsburgh never circulated. A more recent study from a couple years ago from Cornell found 55% of the books published since 1990 have never circulated there. Closer to home, my institution, Grand Valley State, we know 30% of our collections never circulated. I spend $600,000 a year on monographs. That means every year I waste $200,000 on books that just did not meet my users' needs there. So it's a lot of money that we're wasting every year on books that don't get used. And the other thing is to keep in mind is it's expensive to keep these things on the shelves. I sort of refer to what sort of the myth of the one-time cost. This idea is I spent $50 on a book, it doesn't get used, that's okay. It was $50 wasted there. But what we're finding out is that that's not the case. Paul Courant, who's the university librarian at the University of Michigan, he was the former provost at the University of Michigan, he's got an endowed chair in economics. He did a study with Howard Nielsen that found over the course of a lifetime it costs $4.26 per volume per year to keep a book on its shelf there. And so it's not just this one-time cost, there's this ongoing cost that happens there. And many times this is staff time to shift books. I got a tour of your library. I saw your book stacks look very much like our book stacks, very full, which means I buy a bunch of books in literature and the Ps. That means I have to shift those books all around to create room for those new books there. So we spend a lot of time. We're costing us space. We found in our library, we open up space, we move books around, create user space. Our library gets used more and more than ever. And then money, again, staff time, and my institution, we're out of space, we're building a $70 million library. That's a lot of money to house books there. And then opportunity, because if we didn't have to use that space on those books that weren't getting used, spend that staff time, spend that cost to maintain these things, what are those other things that we could be doing? Sort of that opportunity cost, which you really can't necessarily quantify, but it's a very real cost indeed there. Complicating this is really how collections are used. If you're familiar with Chris Anderson's idea of the long tail, this is nothing that's really new for libraries. In the 1960s, Trueswell did a study at the University of Illinois and found that 20% of the library's collection at the University of Illinois drove 80% of the use. So 20% of the collection drove 80% of the use there. This past year, OhioLink, which is a group of libraries in Ohio, did a much larger study looking at millions of books, and this was from universities, from small liberal arts and community colleges all the way up to Ohio State University. And it wasn't 80-20, it's 86, which is, I think, shocking to a lot of us that look at these numbers there. It's 6% of books in an academic library account for 80% of the use there. So a very small number of titles drive the vast majority of usage there in academic libraries. And so what we need to do in libraries is figure out how to efficiently provide access to the resources that people want and need. And this isn't really anything new, but when we talk about efficiently, we're talking about economic efficiency and then timing efficiency. If only 6% drives vast majority of use there, do we need to have all these other books that are either getting zero or very low use immediately on hand? Or are there other ways to provide that access aside from that? Again, the those are just things that are out of control. Sometimes we have to do things differently because we just don't have the money to do them the way we've always done them in the past. And so what I want to talk about next are 6 ways that libraries are trying to do this, provide these different efficiencies. And the first way is exploiting ebooks. So ebooks overcome limits of time and place. With a print book, I have to be where the print book is at. If the print book is with somebody else, I cannot be there at the same time there. And I have to be able to get to that book there. With ebooks, it's not the case. It doesn't matter whether it's 2 a.m., the library's closed, or whether I am 3 states away or 2 counties away or 1 town away there. I can get access to that book at any time, in any place there, and more than one person can generally access those books at the same time. They can also be much more cost effective than print books. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple minutes here. Does not to say that ebooks aren't without their limits. Digital rights management makes it, why these books are so often clunky to use, makes them hard to use at times. There's licensing restrictions that says that. It makes it difficult to do things that we normally do with library books. And then user preferences also, where if we ask students, would you rather use a print book or an ebook? The students will often always say, I want to use a print book there. When in reality, I think sometimes what we find out though is, if you say, would you rather wait 2 days to get a print book, or would you like to use this ebook today? My paper's due tomorrow. Of course I'll use this ebook there. And that's what we find at our institution. So sometimes there's other market pressures that come into play, or economic choices that users make. Other thing libraries are doing is moving away from title by title selection. So I mentioned just a minute ago that just in case collecting is not effective. There's other ways we can do that. A lot of times guessing, we don't guess right. And sometimes if we know what books are going to be purchased, so if we know that David Foster Wallace's new book that came out last year, The Pale King, we knew that was going to be a big book. Why do we have to take the time and effort to choose that book? Let's have that book sent to us automatically. Let's have that book on our shelves. It'll get there faster. There's other ways we can do that as well. So we need to move away from this sort of let's guess what our users want to find more efficient ways of doing that. We're also finding increasing and emerging demands on librarians. We want, at our institution, we want librarians really outside the library, in the classrooms, in faculty's offices, hopefully with their permission, working with them, collaborating with them on different projects there. So we want much more working with faculty and those types of things. And emerging demands, scholarly communications, talking about author rights and copyright and these types of things. We want our librarians doing that. And to be able to do those things, we're not getting any more staff lines. There's no more hours in the day. We need to free them up from some of the things that they've done. If there's ways to find efficiencies in some places like collection development, let's do that. And I think we're finding that technology is making this model obsolete here. That's because we're often seeing libraries move, again, from just title by title to just-in-time purchasing there. And so it's slightly different. We'll often hear purchase on demand. And libraries have been doing purchase on demand for a long time there. So whether it's, the faculty member says, can you buy this book for me? Of course we'll buy that book for you. Or through an ILL request, lots of libraries for a long time and saying, you request a book through your library, we'll just go ahead and buy that book because probably somebody else will want that book as well there. The difference is that is technology. Technology is sort of the difference between purchase on demand and just-in-time purchasing. And we can see this through Amazon. So I talked about ILL purchasing. So at my institution, what we do now is we get an ILL request, and if we meet certain criteria, if it's a fairly new book, we'll just get through Amazon. It'll take us 3 to 7 days to get it from one of our other libraries in the state. But I get from Amazon, I get free 2-day shipping on that book. I'll get a lot faster. And again, we found that those books are likely to get used again and again and again. So we can use Amazon. Amazon also has really radically changed the used book market. It makes it very easy to acquire new used books. And it's not just Amazon, but Libris and some of these other used book vendors that are out there. Time was, with the old model, we had to buy that book when it came out because if we didn't buy it then, we're probably never going to be able to buy that book ever again because once it's out of print, we're out of luck. But what we're seeing with Amazon is that if I miss the book the first time it becomes in demand, I can often get a copy of that book. And often the only things we don't acquire for those when we need those are because they're maybe very expensive. But usually it's not because we can't get our hands on it, especially if it's a book that's published in North America or Europe. Just-in-time purchasing, this is a picture of the espresso book machine. It's been described as sort of the ATM for books there. It has the ability to print a book in just a matter of minutes for just pennies per page there. So we talk about just-in-time purchasing here. Why buy a book just in case if I need that print book? Is it possible to just print that book off and give it to our user in a matter of minutes there? This holds a lot of promise, and a lot of us were really excited when these came out. And the machine costs about $100,000, which is a lot of money, but if I'm wasting $200,000 a year, it's actually a pretty good investment. So the problem is they don't have any books anybody really wants. They have lots of books. They have millions of books. They have millions of books in their catalog, but they're almost all the Google books. They're almost all things that are out of copyright or in the public domain there, which we probably have sitting on our shelves anyways, and I can get for like $2 from Penguin Classics if I don't have it. So there's problems with this. There's a lot of promise, but it's promise for the future. So, which talk about next is ebook patient-driven acquisitions, which overcomes some of the problems we see with the Espresso Book Machine, because I can get current content. So Espresso Book Machine, books published prior to 1926, or is it? Whereas ebooks, we're talking books generally from the mid-1990s to today, and the vast majority of those are books published in the last 5 to 10 years. So it's current content. It's immediate and seamless access. So with Amazon, I have to wait 2 days for the book to show up, which is great. We just did a survey of our students this past year called LibQual, and one of the comments we got was, some people said, I love interlibrary loan, but some students said, yeah, they're always great, but I had to wait 3 days for the book to arrive. When I look at it, I'm like, 3 days, that's great, and they're like, no, it's too long. So this provides immediate, seamless access. They don't have to ask someone to print a book off. It's just there. And it's also very cost effective. At Grand Valley, we've had this program in place for about 3 years. I've got about 130,000 books in my catalog. Last year, we had 10,800 books used, and they were used 22,000 times. If I had purchased those 10,000 books, it would have cost me $852,000. We spent $109,000 on that because we were able to lease those books. Just because a book gets used once, most of these books only get used one time ever, never gets used again. So why buy the book if I can lease access immediately to that book there? The $109,000 looks great compared to $852,000. The 130,000 books we have in our catalog right now, if I had bought all those books, it would have been over $10 million to buy those books. I just have them sit in my catalog. No one ever uses that book. I don't pay a dime for that book. But if someone wants to come across that book and say, that's the book I want, then they have immediate access to it. So we talk about, this would sort of mean by efficiency when we're talking about trying to do things in a slightly different way. Another thing libraries are doing is harnessing mass digitization. So JSTOR, everybody loves JSTOR, who doesn't like JSTOR? And so we've been doing this for a long time, digitizing things. We're also seeing commercial publishers get into this as well. Springer and Elsevier, Sage, Wiley, all digitizing the back files and making these back files available. And so libraries will acquire these and a number of benefits. So it provides users with immediate and easy access to those books. I just click through on your full text finder, whatever you call it here. We're able to free up space. So if I have it through JSTOR at my institution, if we buy a back file from Springer or Elsevier, we have it in JSTOR, we don't hang on to the paper anymore because I don't need the paper anymore because our users don't really want paper. So we have 58,000 electronic journals. We did that survey last fall. Number one complaint we had, you don't have enough journals, electronic. I want more electronic journals. I'm like, 58,000 journals, compared to what you used to have. But they really want it. They want it electronic and they want it right now there. So with journals, mass digitization really provides a lot of benefits for libraries. And what we're starting to see is that books, mass digitization of books. So a lot of probably familiar with the Google Book Project they digitized in 7 years what libraries estimated would take them several hundred years to do with, I don't know how, but with Google's money probably. So it was really amazing what they were able to accomplish. And then the Hadi Trust, which is a consortium of libraries that primarily based on the Google Book Project. So University of Michigan and a bunch of other libraries that are involved in the Google Book Project have worked together now to sort of build on this. Right now, Hadi Trust has 10 million volumes. 2.8 million of those are in the public domain, which means we can access the full text of those titles there. They're enhancing these titles. They're improving on the OCR, so when the full text search with lots of errors in the Google because they were doing everything really fast. Hadi Trust says we're going to do this like a library would do it. We want to make sure this is really right. They're enhancing the metadata, the descriptions of those books there, make sure everything's correct. They're also working on preservation there. So they're just working this past year on trying to set aside 1 or 2 print copies in dark archives of all those 10 million volumes that are in the collection there so that they are preserved not only electronically but also in a physical copy as well. And then they're providing full text searchability, which is a very radical change. Not only can you go do that through the Hadi Trust website, but lots of libraries now, they're partnering with commercial. They're a nonprofit. They just want to make this available for libraries and for library users there. So about 40% of my library's collection is available in the Hadi Trust. They can do a search through our main search interface and search the full text of all those 40% of our catalog there. So it's not just using now a 150-word catalog record that you find in the catalog. I'm searching a 200-page book and the full text there. The example I saw that our vendor was using to show how this enhancement works. They did a search for goulash recipes. And so, strangely enough, our catalog, 3 hits came back in our regular catalog for goulash. But you did a search through our full text search with the Hadi Trust, and we got like 30 hits back though. So you're finding things you would never find otherwise if you just rely on these catalog records through full text searchability there. So, and it's it's sort of a silly example there, but it's the idea that if we're doing something on the Copperhead movement during the Civil War, if I'm just relying on catalog record, how many things I'm missing that are in books that cover those type of topics there. So again, all these 3 things combined really provide libraries an opportunity to do different things, not only from a discoverability standpoint and ease of access, but also how we manage sort of our print legacy collection. When we talk about legacy collections, we're talking about the old stuff that we have sitting on our shelves. Next thing, talk about initiative libraries are doing is sort of abandoning what I call the ownership imperative. Time was libraries felt we had to, if we bought something, we need to hang on to it. And we have to, if it's an important title, we need to actually own that. We need to have a physical copy of that. And so you have these long runs of journals that often don't get used a lot. And what we're faced with today is, in many ways, because of budget issues, is that we're having to rely on third parties for access for both books and for journals. So an example from Grand Valley, this is the Journal of Accountancy. And you can see all the different places where users can access this journal here. And I can look at this and I can see that I have 4 different third-party vendors provide. I see that EBSCO, ProQuest, Gale, LexisNexis all provide access to this. Plus, I've got a subscription to this journal as well on my own there. Do I need 5 ways to access the current subscription, the current issue of the Journal of Accountancy? Probably not. So what we've been working very hard and what a lot of libraries have been doing is relying on databases like Academic Search Complete for journals, or perhaps like eBrary's Academic Complete for books, to say, you provide access, we'll subscribe to your product there. I may not have ownership of it there, but this is a more cost-effective way of doing things. And again, not that libraries want to do these things, but in many ways it's if I have to say I cancel Journal of Accountancy and I have 0 access, or I cancel a title and I still have access from 4 different vendors to the full text of that. The full text access is better than 0 access and relying on interlibrary alone in a lot of ways. So sort of a difficult choice that we have to make sometimes. And then cooperative collection development, talk about 2 percentages here. We talk about cooperative collection development. This is working together. 35%, and this is the percentage of books that are available as ebooks today. When a new book is published, 35% of the books published this year are available in ebooks. So even if we wanted to go completely electronic, we would not be able to completely rely on ebooks if we wanted to there. So we don't have a choice. Print remains a necessity there. So we can't go completely electronic if we wanted to. The other one, 6%, talks about this 86 rule again, where 6% of our library's collections drive 80% of the use there. So what we need to do is figure out what that 6% is, and make sure our users have immediate access to that 6%. And then for the rest of that, 94% of our collections, we need to partner together with other libraries to provide access to that. We don't all need to have all these same books and the same amount of duplication. So when we talk about purchasing new materials, Western Washington's part of the Orbis Cascade Alliance, and they're doing wonderful things of partnering together to provide access on purchasing books there. Michigan, we can only dream of these things. We buy all the same books that no one uses over and over again, and we're helped by all of the different libraries there. And then on preserving access, libraries partner together. So WEST, which is a consortium of libraries in the West Coast, but I think generally folks in California, the Center for Research Libraries, the 5 colleges, the consortium in Massachusetts of private colleges, they're all working together to preserve access to journals. So they're all focused on JSTOR. Everybody's focused on preserving JSTOR. JSTOR is going to be well preserved. JSTOR preserves itself through University of California system and at Harvard. But everybody else wants to preserve JSTOR as well for some reason. So I think JSTOR is covered, but they're working very hard to preserve access to these journals and preserve them. When it comes to books, in Michigan we have our shared print initiative, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And in Maine's doing what they call the Maine shared collection strategy, working on figuring out ways that these books that we all own that are very low use that we're all hanging on to, do we all need to hang on to so many copies of these books that people are not using? So what do all these shifts mean for legacy collections? And again, these are the things that are sitting on our shelves, our old back collections there. I think first thing it means is that we can keep a lot less things on our shelves while retaining access to our content. Again, we want to focus on the things that are in high demand that our users need immediate access to, and then figure out how we can provide reasonable levels of access to the rest of it. And where to focus, and this one's going to get asked a lot. I think the first area, so 2 areas to focus. First one is deduplicating print electronic collections there. We're going to talk about JSTOR, talk about some things to say. I think it's safe to say that we can discard our JSTOR volumes and other journal backfile volumes. These are being well preserved, both electronically through things like Portico and clocks and some of these electronic backup systems that we have, and also with firm dark copies that are in dark archives that will be preserved in climate-controlled environments that will stand the test of time there. So these are not things that are going to go away. These are not things that are being handled in sort of a haphazard way. These are very much preserved. And I think we're starting to see Hadi Trust as an emerging area there. So at my institution, we're very aggressive with JSTOR. Every year, new JSTOR volumes come out. We discard the print that we can because we're very tight on space. Hadi Trust is something that we're starting to see. If I have a book that's in the public domain, 2.8 million volumes in the public domain, and I have the exact same copy in my library and it's not been used for 20, 25, 30 years, do I need to hang on to that copy if I can provide a digital surrogate to that title there? Do I need to hang on to that, especially if I'm tight on space there and think about how much it costs to keep that book on the shelf year after year after year? And I can say this is not something that Grand Valley we've done, it's something we're starting to talk about there. I think it's something it's been happening very rapidly over the last 2-3 years, and so I think a lot of libraries are starting to think about how we can take advantage of these types of collections. And the other way we can focus on these legacy collections is to reduce the number of locally held low-use titles there. So I talked about the Michigan Shared Print Initiative. We've taken a very conservative approach in Michigan. 7 state university libraries working together. And we're looking at extremely low-use items. These are books that have had 3 or fewer circulations among all 7 libraries, so total among 7 libraries, since 1998, which is about as far back as we can go with our data. So if a book was used 4 times, we're not even considering it among 7 libraries. So, and then what we're doing is making sure that book's being preserved by 2 different libraries, and then the rest of us are, if we have the option of then discarding that, knowing that I can know that Wayne State University and Central Michigan University are going to hang on to that book, so I can discard that book if I don't feel it's relevant for my collection anymore. And using a very, very conservative, we found that there's 340,000 titles at a minimum that we might be able to discard that meet all this criteria. There are still 2 copies being preserved, been used 3 or fewer times there. So there's a lot of yield that's out there for libraries to create space there without really probably having much impact on the users at all there. So let's shift gears a little bit, or change gears. So talk about a second shift here, which is from really building collections to providing access to information, looking at scholarly communications there. And this is really the shift of the library from being a consumer to a producer of information. And sort of 2 ways this is manifesting itself in libraries. The first one's open access publishing support funds. And the second one's really providing support and infrastructure for the production and distribution of scholarly output at a university. So we'll talk about open access first here. Talk about open access journals. So we can see here, this chart shows the growth in open access, peer-reviewed open access journals from 2005 through 2011. You can see it goes from less than 2,000 to more than 7,000 in a very short period of time. These are not everything, these are peer-reviewed titles in the Directory of Open Access Journals. David Lewis, who's the dean at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, that's a mouthful to say, he projects that by 2025, 90% of journal articles that are published will be open access there. And what's happened is, part of what's driving this is this change in publishing models that we're seeing is really accelerating the change from sort of our current model to this newer model. And it's really been driven by one journal that's really started this, which is PLOS One, which is what we describe as a mega journal. And what a mega journal is a journal that provides rapid peer review. And by rapid peer review, what they do is they look at subjective criteria, look at whether it's scientifically rigorous, whether it's ethical, whether they properly reported, whether the conclusions match what the data provides there, versus objective criteria, how important the article was, or does it match the scope of the journal there. These journals are not limited by size, and they're open access. And so the open access fees are paid for by the articles that are submitted there. So if it's accepted and it gets to be published, it has to pay the open access fees there. You can see here, PLOS One, its growth, 2007, 1,200 articles published, 2011, 13,000. And PLOS is in many ways very reputable. PLOS Biology is one of their journals they publish there, which has the top impact factors in biology. So these are not just vanity presses here. These are very rigorous, and some of the top journals, some of the top scholars are publishing in these journals in their fields. And these are being heavily cited as well. And we can see the growth of PLOS, and both as the meeting the demands of scholars to publish in these type of journals, along with the fact that it's a very profitable organization. It's very much in the black, and not having the problems that other ones are really leading to a lot of copycat journals as well. The first one is really probably Scientific Reports, which is Nature's version of a mega journal. Then we have BMJ, Sage, Cell. Lots of our traditional publishers are coming out with these sort of mega journals there. And other ones that are not coming out with mega journals, so Springer doesn't have a mega journal, but Springer has said that they will not, any new journals they start from now on will be open access journals. They're not starting up any new traditional journals anymore. So we've seen this sort of real shift from our traditional for-profit publishers, Cell and Nature, to this new models that we're starting to see there. So what's the role for libraries? I would argue the role for libraries in all this is these open access publishing support funds. And what these funds do, my font showed up. It would tell you what it does if you could see the white text there. What they do is they, essentially libraries pay the open access fees to publish these. So most open access journals charge no fees to publish. These mega journals and lots of other open access journals do charge fees to cover the cost of publishing that. There's this sort of misnomer that you can publish a journal for no cost at all. There's costs that are involved in publishing any journal, from whether it's the peer review to the system to managing the peer review to the system that you host those on there. So there's costs involved. For open access journals that charge no open access fees, those costs are often being covered by somebody else. They're saying we'll cover those fees. In other cases, they have to recover that cost to do that or make a slight profit off of that. So that's where the library's role is, to start to make this shift from we're going to subscribe to a journal to we'll pay to make that article open access to publish that article there. And so we're seeing lots of institutions publish these, set up these funds. Cornell, MIT, Michigan, Duke, Harvard, all the places that do that. But what we're starting to see is that other institutions, UNC Greensboro and Grand Valley State, we both started open access publishing support funds this past year to pay the open access fees there. If we say that we need to move toward open access, libraries really have to be able to support that shift by moving funds away from our traditional models toward these new models. Otherwise, the shift's going to take a lot longer, and it may be much more difficult there. At a lot of research institutions, faculty have grants to do that. I can say a lot of our scholars don't have grants to cover a lot of these things. And we haven't done a lot of promotion of our fund at this point. Really, we launched in the fall, really got up and off the ground running a couple weeks into the winter semester, this past semester, and we've already funded 3 articles there with really no promotion at all, just through word of mouth. They found out. We'll be doing a big push on there because we know there's probably lots of people are publishing or want to publish in these types of journals. They just can't afford to do it on their own. We don't know about the demand that they're having there. So that's one way that libraries are shifting from the consumer to producer. The other way is by supporting the production and distribution of scholarship. This happened on a large scale, so through library and university press partnerships. University of Michigan, Penn State, Purdue, all these university presses now are actually part of the library system. They're matching up with the library's missions and goals there, which is having a lot of changes there. But we don't work at Michigan or Penn State or Purdue. But they're still having a lot smaller scale as well. And this is happening through institutional repositories or through open source journal publishing software. And here's some different examples of that. If you're not familiar with institutional repositories, what these are software systems that institutions will set up to collect and preserve the institution's scholarly output. And then they make that scholarly output available to people around the world. And then they promote that and it really serves to promote both scholars and institutions there. So it sort of has a promotional aspect and then sort of a beneficial aspect for making those things available to people all over the world. Our institutional repository, it's very small, about 3,000 items, and we've had 140 different countries have downloaded things in the past year from our repository. So and it's kind of amazing now we can start to see institutions where people are downloading stuff from. It's amazing where they're coming from. We've seen some really consistent growth in institutional repositories. 2007, there was about 962. We're up to about 2,500, almost 2,600 in 2011 there. So we've seen really fairly slow and steady growth in these institutions there. And the original premise behind all of these was sort of this, you build it, they'll come. I tried to find a picture of Dyersburg, Iowa, where they had the Field of Dreams. Couldn't find that, So I've been there. I should have taken a picture too. But this idea was that if we build these things, faculty in all their free time, then will come and put all their articles that they've published into their repositories, And I think what we found was that faculty are apparently busy. They have lots of things that they're doing, lots of demands on their time, so this doesn't necessarily work there. And so we do have faculty that come to us and they will put their papers in their repository. But what we found where we came out and found that there's all these other needs and roles for repositories at the university that we didn't even think about, that we didn't even know about. And we're finding out new things all the time. And just some examples. Campus conferences, lots of conferences happen on universities, and often we don't capture the output of that conference. We don't capture, there's no formal proceedings there. We don't capture the lectures. We don't capture the papers that came out of those conferences there. Repositories can do that. Open education resources, open textbooks there. This is a real growing area, growth area, where we're seeing lots more faculty trying to put together open textbooks, free textbooks that they distribute on the internet based on the high cost of these traditional textbooks there. Repositories can host these things. Theses and dissertations, this is a very traditional role for institutional repositories, along with probably faculty scholarship. This was the other sort of driving focus to make these electronic theses and dissertations available instead of on the bound volume on the shelf, make them available on the web. Open data is probably a newer area there. This is an area, Purdue's been one of the leading institutions on this, of making data available. This is sort of fraught with lots of problems. What they found was at Purdue, they said that faculty are very interested in other people's data, but they really would like to hang on to their own data there. So they like to use everybody else's, but they want to make sure they get every last paper out of their own data that they have their hands on there. And the other problem with this is that lots of libraries, we don't have the expertise to manage data in a very sophisticated way that we need to have that. But this is an area that's a growth. And then journal publishing. This is a very major area for us. This is a journal that we host in our institutional repository. It's for the Michigan Council of Teachers of English. It's just a small regional publication. It's been published for about 20 some years. And it's our most downloaded thing. This little journal, they still print everything. They do the same way. They put out paper volume about 4 times a year. And we host it on them. And after 18 months, we put the back file of that journal becomes available. So it's sort of a moving wall. After every 18 months, we put a new issue available for people to download. And this gets downloaded for us, little journal, 7,000 times a month. The articles from this journal get downloaded there. So huge global impact that we can have for a tiny journal which is not indexed. They had, I think, 1 volume for 1 year got indexed in MLA, and that's it. So, but people are finding it because it's on the internet. So just want to sort of conclusion, circle back around. We talked about, libraries, we're sort of at a crossroads there. We can continue on the same path, and we can sort of just react to the changes, the things that are out of our control. Journal prices continue to go up. Things are going to continue to change. Production is going to continue to increase there. Budgets are going to continue to decrease. Or I would argue that we could chart a new course, and we can sort of set our own direction there. And that's what I would argue libraries should be doing, that we should really chart our own course there. And we need to do this, we need to take advantage of technology to radically change our buildings and staff there. We can do this, we can free up space for users, which will really increase the use of libraries in general. We can transition staff away from the $50 decision. This is Dennis Dillon, who used to be the Associate Dean for Collections at the University of Texas, said we need to move librarians from $50 decisions to $50,000 decisions. This idea of let's do things that have much greater impact on our users there and on our campuses there. We need to move toward more efficient collection practices there, move away from just in case to just-in-time practices there. And then we need to partner with our campuses to make research more freely available to the world in general, and to promote our campuses and what we're doing there. So thank you all very much. We have some time for questions. Went a little long, but I'd be happy to answer any questions, listen to any comments that people might have. I'm sorry. Yes. We use bpress's Digital Commons. There's that's a proprietary package. It's hosted, so we pay a subscription fee to them. There's lots of other ones that are open source, whether it's DSpace or ePrints there. The trade-off is we pay somebody else to manage it versus having to take staff time to have somebody else manage that, to handle the open source ones for us. Any other questions?
I'm interested in what you're saying about withdrawals. Like you said, did you say that your library hasn't yet gone the route of identifying things that are available out of copyright in like print materials that are available online and getting rid of the print ones. That's not something you guys have done yet, or how are you thinking of going about that?
So I have a list of those items, and so we partnered with a vendor. So for part of our Michigan Shared Print project, right now what we're looking at is actually a subset of that. So I'm looking at just a smaller set of a few thousand titles I'm looking to withdraw this summer. But I have this whole other list of titles that I know print copies are being preserved, and that I also know are available publicly through the Hadi Trust. And so those are generally in literature. And so what we have to figure out is whether that's something we want to do and what it might be, or what are the pros and cons of doing that. And probably talk with amongst ourselves and see if it's something we want to roll out to our faculty and to get their feedback and ideas on those things there. And what we might do is take a subset of things and find out. Some institutions are doing some trying out. If we make it available print, electronic, does the print get used or does electronic get used? I know Occidental is starting to look at this, private college in California, starting to see if, start doing an experiment with that and trying to take a look at that data. And there's lots of problems with that, trying to do a controlled experiment on that and you get equal choice on that. That's something that we're starting to look at there. So it seems to make sense to a certain extent. Why hang on to these print books that nobody's using if I can provide a digital surrogate and get in a couple days a print copy?
Do you guys use e-readers too then, or like?
We do. We're starting to circulate iPads now and trying to figure out how to do those on the iPads and how to make them easily usable on the iPads is a bit problematic at times. So we're still figuring that piece out there. We just started circulating those this year, but they've been in very high demand. We're trying to figure out what students want to use them for, because they're using them a lot. We just don't know what they're using them for. Are they actually studying on them, or are they, who knows what they're doing with them? Yes. So. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, no, a lot of what you said made sense, and it's interesting. And what I wonder is, so it sounds like what you're saying is, as new technologies become available and new ways of access become available to make scholarship available, libraries can reallocate the way in which they think about developing collections. And so, but in a sense, it's still about collections. And so what I'm curious about is, there's also a trend towards moving away from what you're talking about to doing other kinds of ancillary services. And so what I'm curious about is, well, how do we, if we have a significant amount of savings by what you're saying, shouldn't those savings go back into the university? Or alternatively, shouldn't those savings be used to actually develop and continue to make accessible collections, whether print or electronic?
Yeah. So when we talk about collections, there's this debate of, do you make everything possible available to your users there, or do you try to curate the sort of discovery layers, sort of the term that's in vogue among people that talk about this? And so do you start to say, I'm going to collect in the same categories I always collected before because I think that's what our users want, or do you say, I'm going to make everything available that I can get my hands on because apparently I'm not good at guessing what my users want there. And so many of the savings you have aren't necessarily financial savings, although we're starting to see some financial savings there. But what's happening is that my inflationary increases for journals every year, I have to find $160,000 to cover all my inflationary costs. And so that often eats up any savings there. But it's the staff time that really becomes a big savings there. And how do we reallocate those staff from whether they're the staff that used to catalog the books or get them on the shelf, the books people used to shelf them, to other things that perhaps have greater value. And sometimes it's identifying what that greater value is. And it might vary from institution to institution. Our institution, the model we're going with is, let the writing center do what they do, let the tutoring center do what they do, but let's try and bring them into the library and partner with us there, where other institutions might say, well, we're IT and libraries combined together, so we don't, so we're going to continue to sort of find those synergies there. So it's going to vary from institution to institution, but I think where, again, the savings becomes is very much a human resource savings in a lot of ways, and not advocating cut lines, it's finding all these other awesome things like institutional repositories, scholarship and copyright. There's other things that libraries could do if we didn't have to do title by title selection. So I don't know if that answered, if I just talked long enough that,
Both.
All right, awesome. Other questions? Yes.
In terms of storage of strictly digital media,
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any expertise or interest or concerns with stability of those media? Like, how long are they going to last? time? You know, all the various ways that we're storing all this stuff.
Expertise? No. So what we're trying to do, and this is, you know, I think with ebook vendors for new ebooks, this is a concern for us. And with journals, because with book publishers, what they've done, the book passes, they print books, they sell them to libraries or to users, and the libraries take care of preserving things. Journals, much the same way. The journal, you know, Elsevier publishes a journal, they sell it to a library. The library community figures out how to preserve those things. And so what we're starting to see are things like Portico, which is, it's a system that has lots of redundancies to preserve lots of journal content, and they're moving toward ebook content. With ebooks, what they're finding though is it's a publisher by publisher agreement there, versus if I get most of our ebooks we acquire from third-party aggregators that then set up the agreement with the publisher. So they don't have the rights to do the preservation there. So it is a problematic thing there. It's what we have to sort of balance out is what level of risk are we taking here? So if a company goes under, do we lose all those books that we relied on them? Or do we feel confident enough that there's enough lucrative market there, so if they have problems that somebody else would take their place there? And it's very much, a number of years ago, a journal provider, the libraries use these journal providers like EBSCO, or it's a company called Faxon that libraries we'd send $250,000 and say, subscribe to these journals for us there. And they went out of business, and all libraries lost all this money. All these libraries lost all this money that they had sent to them there. And so there's a level of risk when we rely on any sort of third party to do these things. Now, could libraries, would it be safer for us to subscribe to each of those journals individually? Yes, but to manage 5,000 journal subscriptions by ourselves is just not manageable there. So there's a low level of risk involved, and we need to figure those things out. And in many ways, like with a product like Portico, the fiscal responsibility is falling on the libraries. The publishers are not stepping up, the libraries are stepping up on that. And would it be nice to say the publishers should do that? Yeah, but they're not going to do it. So we have to sort of invest on the infrastructure there and spend that money on essentially it's an insurance policy just in case something bad happens. So it's a reality there. So yes.
I was wondering about the utility of ebooks for course reserves.
Mm-hmm.
Are your faculty able to take like a chapter from an ebook and put it on reserve and the whole class can access it? Or?
Sometimes. Depends on the vendor. So
that seems like one of the downfalls.
So we counted up, we have about 1 million ebooks. We have a lot of big ebook collection. We have about 1 million in our catalog available. We have about 60,000 in our catalog. So, and we have about 30 different platforms those are available on from different companies. And so what we try to do are get ones where they can put individual chapters on there, or they can link to it. And we want multiple users to be able to access those books. So some ebooks, only one person can get into it at a time. So then you decide, does the electronic outweigh the paper as far as those pieces go? But that's our goal, is to be able to provide so they have multiple users get in there. And we do that a lot, where we're putting those on there. And the number of the vendors we work with allow us to get right to that chapter level and link right to that chapter level. That's really our goal, because again, it's much more efficient for us there. So it's a mixed bag, but we do see a lot of uptake on that. And ebooks are much clunkier than we want, but again, it's sort of, you weigh the pros and cons there. If you wait for it to be a perfect solution, you keep on waiting forever and ever. So it's that perfect, the enemy of good idea there. So, yes.
I'm interested in your comments about shifting the use of the library staff as a resource. Are you familiar with the Citation Project?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
It was started by some rhetoric comp people out of Drew and Syracuse, and they're looking at how students are using sources. And there are some pretty disturbing findings that are coming out of that study. For example, the single most common use is of the public internet. That's the first thing. And then also that they're citing, when they cite, the first page of whatever source it is. So some real concerns about how student users, and I don't know, maybe faculty users, but student users are, is some of your staff assuming more and more roles of educating students on how to best use the sources you have?
Well, it's one of the things we're trying to do. We're trying to get as far as, it's a delicate balance there. So we don't want to tell faculty how they should teach their students how to do things there. But through our information literacy instruction, we want to try to help them be effective users and effectively integrate information in there. So, so not necessarily exactly on that, but what we're trying to do, we talk about reallocating staff, is to try and spend more time on information literacy instruction versus sort of the click here, click here, say goodbyes. We're trying to make our systems more efficient there, trying to invest more staff in technology. So we've been able to bring in our first programmer we ever had to be able to do programming for us to try and make our systems a little more seamless than we've had in the past there. So in those ways, we're trying to reallocate the staff. But I think there's a delicate balance we try to walk there, and the faculty will set the curriculum, and then we're there to support that, and try in a lot of places where there's expectation that we're going to integrate information literacy into the curriculum, that we'll do those pieces there, or support faculty if they want to integrate that in themselves there, those skills that we really feel are important for sort of effective users of information. Yes?
What 6% is being used the most? What's driving the use? What areas?
I don't think we know at this point in time. So the data that Ohio Links provide, it's all openly available, and they're still sort of crunching the data. They were able to provide a superficial report at this point on the basic data, so we don't know as far as like subject areas or what time periods and those pieces there. The data is all available. I don't know if people are, I know consortium OCLC they're the ones that partnered with them on this, and they're starting to do the research. They have a research arm that's trying to figure those pieces out there, because I think it has a lot of implications to figure out how we provide access, because we can look at my institution and see what things I see, but it's very difficult to generalize that. But when we have a sample of millions of books and millions of uses there, it seems like we should be able to get a lot better data and better understanding of different institutions and different types of institutions. So what happens at a R1 institution is going to be very different at a comprehensive versus a liberal arts, or even a small comprehensive versus a large comprehensive. I think we'll start to see those things, and that's the nice thing about that project is there's so many different types of institutions. There should be something that we should be able to mark up against and sort of start to benchmark against to try to understand better how we do things and how our collections are being used there, because the data we can pull out is, and the time we can put in investing into analyzing, it's limited at best, I think, based on our systems.
I guess one of the things you can't track with the physical book is how many times it gets lifted off the shelf. It's not like the alcohol bottle in your hotel refrigerator room there.
Exactly. We could try that model, but
Not that
the mini bar model.
So we're measuring statistics on circulation in one area, and on the first time they hit the first page on something else in the electronic area, and those seem to be very different kinds of.
Absolutely, there's definitely not apples to apples, and in some of the studies that have been done, the consultant that we're working with on our shared print project, they will look at what different libraries provide. We looked at circulation. We looked at just circulation. There was a discussion of, do we look at usage? Because some libraries track shelving stats, and then libraries have tried to figure out the ratio of circulations to browses, and then how many browses that you catch equal browses you didn't catch. It starts to become this sort of tree falls in the forest type of idea of how do you do this type of thing. But yeah, they're all imperfect measures there. But I think in many libraries, I think if you just do the old-fashioned just dust test, we know there's massive amounts of our collection that just don't get used at all. So, and we know in certain disciplines, especially in the humanities, the browsing is an important piece of what happens. But we also know, if you look at the growth of interdisciplinary studies, your pros talk about how you have two interdisciplinary colleges, that browsing is, for interdisciplinary studies, is horrible. I mean, because it's one person that knows nothing about your curriculum deciding that this book is about geography, and it's not about history, it's not about sociology, it's not about this. And so how many books do we miss? And that's where that sort of power of the full text search, to be able to come up with these search engines that can actually search and mine the full text of these works, and trying to come up with better results that, we use Google because Google works. Our library catalogs are woefully inadequate. They don't work very well. And the new sort of discovery products are coming out are better, but they still kind of stink. And we still have to come to the point where what we want is that, I can click on I'm feeling lucky, and there's the book I need for that search there. And we're not there yet, but if Google can do it, we should be able to get closer and closer and closer and continue to refine. And it comes again to a matter of choices, and do you wait to make these changes? And sometimes you can't wait because the changes are forced upon you for that perfect product, that perfect data point that you're looking for. So it's again, there's pros and cons, and it's a matter of choices, unfortunately, and not always ideal choices.
It feels, from a faculty perspective, that sometimes we're getting more and more things shifted to us, whether it's clerical and filling out forms, and now apparently it's going to be subsidizing our own publications directly, because maybe that's one of the things that gets cut in libraries are those types of funds. So it doesn't look like a particularly attractive slope from that perspective, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's where we have to, again, sort of react to those and sort of see these changes coming on and be able to make the case for this is why we need to do this. So when we rolled our publishing support fund out, we rolled out in the fall, wasn't even ready to go. When we had started going to lots of departmental meetings at that point there, because they were like, what do you mean? You're just from all these vanity presses you're supporting, and we've tried to explain to them there's a lot of misunderstandings of those things. But we have to, if we wait until the shift happens to start making those changes, then we'll really be in bad shape. And that's why we think we need to start looking at our budgets and reallocating those budgets now versus waiting till 90% of the articles are being published on open access, and then faculty are saying, I can't afford to publish this, and how am I supposed to get tenure? The model we're at now, if you look at humanities faculty, we're cutting book budgets all over the place there. University presses are in dire straits, and faculty in humanities are saying, where do I get published? I need my monograph to get tenure, and university presses can't support that. And look at some of the things that we talked about, sort of the ebook patron-driven, we're releasing books and things like that. University presses are saying, hey, this is going to kill us. And we're saying, I think the library community says, is my job here to support the university presses and keep them at other institutions to keep those afloat, or is my job to provide access to my user population? And these are all sort of hard decisions, but the academy is really sort of a major sort of area of flux when it comes to scholarly communications. And so I don't have good answers for you, and it doesn't always seem very good, but I think we sort of have to be proactive versus reactive to these changes and start to sort of chart our own course.
Well, we're out of time. I want to thank Doug for coming. I want to thank you guys for coming, and we're going to have this video online on Viking Village, so we urge you to keep the conversation going, to have your colleagues talk about this stuff, and help us get some feedback on some of the things that Doug's presented. Thanks a lot.